Here on this site that the relics, the bones of St Magnus, were brought and enshrined. This magnificent cathedral was built as a site of pilgrimage to house the shrine of a saint, and it encouraged pilgrims from all over Northern Europe to come to this spot and venerate the relics of St Magnus. St Magnus was the Earl of Orkney in the 12th century. He shared the power with his cousin Håkon, and between the two of them they ruled the islands. But they had very different characters and they fell out. There was power plays on both sides and a very different ruling style from the cousins. And eventually they realised that they had to come to some agreement as to how Orkney was to be governed. They took themselves off to the island of Egilsey, and they had an agreement that they would both take an equal number of ships, an equal number of men, and that the men would be unarmed. There was to be no conflict at this meeting. Unfortunately, Magnus was betrayed.
Earl Magnus had been sentenced to death. Earl Håkon told Ofeg, his standard-bearer, to behead him, but he refused angrily. Then Håkon ordered Leifolf, his cook. As he was being led to his execution, he spoke to Leifolf. "Stand right in front of me," he said, "and strike me a hard blow on the head. It's unfitting for a chieftain to be beheaded like a thief. Take heart, poor fellow, and don't be afraid. I've prayed God to grant you his mercy." With that, he crossed himself and stooped to receive the blow, and took a single stroke on the middle of his head, and so his soul passed away to heaven. The place where Earl Magnus was beheaded was rocky and overgrown with moss, but soon God revealed how worthy he was in his eyes, for the spot turned to a fair meadow, and he himself won the beauty and greenness of paradise, which is called the land of the living. Afterwards, a church was built there. Earl Håkon would not permit Earl Magnus's body to be brought to church.
Magnus was martyred here on the Isle of Egilsey. He wasn't afforded a proper Christian burial. His mother Thora pleaded with Håkon to allow her son a Christian burial.
Thora, the mother of Magnus, successfully petitioned Håkon to allow her son to be buried at the cathedral in Bursey.
In those days, Bursey was the centre of power on the islands of Orkney, as opposed to Kirkwall. It was here that the earls had their seat of power.
Over the years, Earl Håkon established himself as a strong ruler, and he himself converted from his evil ways after a pilgrimage to the Holy Land.
He was originally buried in Bursey, and almost immediately strange things began to happen. Lights were seen floating over the gravesite. Heavenly fragrances could be detected coming from the earth, and people started claiming miracles. They had been cured of this sickness or that madness. And a cult grew up around Magnus, and people said this man was a holy man. He was a saint. As time went on, these stories were heard by a little boy growing up in Norway. His name was Ronald, and he went on to become the Earl of Orkney himself. He was Magnus's nephew, and he swore that if the people of Orkney supported him, that he would build them a magnificent stone minster in honour of his uncle Magnus. And that he did. In the 1150s, the cathedral was consecrated and the relics of Magnus were brought here and enshrined in a magnificent shrine. It would have been richly decorated, gold, precious jewels, enamels, and the pilgrims came from all over Northern Europe. The cathedral was extended as more and more pilgrims wanted to come and venerate the relics. But in 1560, everything changed. Scotland went through a reformation. It became a Protestant country. The shrine was dismantled, the relics of St Magnus disappeared, and it was assumed that they had been destroyed. And then, in 1919, whilst the building was under restoration, a workman working on this pillar here, this stone wall, discovered a loose stone. When it was prized from the wall, they realised that there was a cavity, there was a hole in the wall that went right the way back into the structure, and deep, deep, buried inside it, there was an object. When they brought it out, they discovered it was a wooden box. And when they opened it, inside there was a set of bones. The skull had a huge hole cleft in the top of it, exactly as if it had been hit by an axe. Could these be the relics of St Magnus? Well, they were taken to Aberdeen University in the 1920s and they were examined at great length. Professor Reid of Aberdeen University, a professor of anatomy, declared that these must be the bones of St Magnus himself. In 1925, the bones were put back in the wall, and that's where they remain to this day. We assume that during the 1560s, the clerics of the cathedral were told to destroy the bones, but they didn't. They decided instead to hide them in the most important, the most spiritually charged, the holiest part of the cathedral, feet away from when his original shrine would have been. So we are the only church in Scotland to have the bones of their original saint. We are very fortunate that St Magnus still resides within this pillar and keeps watch over us all.